Triplex Locomotive. So this one's a weird one, and I'm only putting it low on this list because while it is a hideously bad design, it was super experimental, and it was only made to do a very specific thing, and to be fair, in that regard, it was actually super good at it. Triplexes are, well, there were a few that were made, but the one we're going to focus on are things like the 2882 locomotives, stuff made by, like, Erie. These were experimental designs that basically were a bunch of steam engines strapped together. That's basically what they were. You're probably familiar with stuff like the 4884, the big boy, which were widely successful. Those are duplex locomotives. These were triplex, even larger than a big boy. Now you may be wondering, well, why wasn't this more successful? Well, as it turns out, getting 3 frickin' steam engines to work in tandem with one body is actually a monumental undertaking. It is vastly inefficient to do things that way. The systems just weren't designed for this kind of tandem power. Now, in that vein though, they were exceedingly powerful. These are probably some of the most powerful steam engines ever produced. But the problem with that is, how efficient were they? And the answer is, they weren't at all. Most were either scrapped or broken down after they were tested. They were very good at what they were designed to do, which was banking. Basically, they were designed to help heavy trains get over steep inclines. This required a lot of tractive effort, but low speed, about 10 miles per hour. And in that vein, they were exceedingly good at that because they were quite powerful. But they never were able to exceed a certain speed length, and some of them couldn't even go faster than 5 miles per hour tops. Again, very strong, very powerful, but not fast enough. This created a lot of issues when it came to, like, moving them to, like, other banks. You couldn't efficiently put a triplex at every single bank in your railway. It just wasn't realistic to do it that way, and at the end of the day, they were too expensive to keep around when they weren't really doing anything that you couldn't just get a couple steam engines, both of which could move at about, 50 miles per hour at least, could do just fine. So like I said, they were scrapped or broken down at the end of the day. Now, again, I keep them low on this list because they were experimental. They were in their test phase, and it was pretty evident that they weren't gonna work out, so I don't really consider them a massive flop on the basis that, you know, it was worth a shot. It looked pretty interesting. Like, they're neat and all. I like how big they are. But, you know, bigness comes with its drawbacks. Hilariously, George R. Henderson was granted a U.S. patent in 1914 for a ridiculous quadruplex locomotive, a 28882 locomotive. This was never actually built because, wow, no, do not, no, that was not going to work. I think they were just messing around at this point, if I'm being honest. But yeah, they were considering going bigger, but that never happened as far as anyone seems to know. They stopped at tri, because once they realized triplexes weren't going to work, going bigger seemed unrealistic, and I don't necessarily blame them. The British Rail Class 74. British Rail, I don't know, I promise you, I am not trying to do this. It just seems like British Rail likes being on these lists. I don't know what it is. Now, in the history of British Rail, they do have a long-standing issue of mismanagement, and they do have a lot of bad ideas under their belt. But I think we have to remember that part of the problem is that British Rail was responsible for a lot more train designs than a lot of other railway companies. Since most of these separate railway companies were combined into the solo British Rail outing, as I understand it, in the UK, it meant that they were responsible for every single rail line over an entire country. And while the UK isn't exactly big on the, long-standing scale of countries, it meant that they were doing a lot of different things. So it's not so much that British Rail was necessarily incompetent, although in some ways I think they were. It was also that they were making a lot of different trains. So the chances of them having bad ones is a little higher, which I think is why they're still on my list and keep appearing repeatedly. This isn't the only one on this list is what I'm trying to say. Let's talk about the Class 74. The Class 74 was actually meant to be the next generation in terms of electric diesel engines. And at the time, this was in the late 1960s, dieselization had pretty much taken over, and they were trying to upgrade and to do things, futuristic and exciting, and it had a decent design for the time, and there were a lot of things about it that were very cool, mostly involving that they had an entirely electronic system, where every single button, relay, things like that, was actually controlled through electronics. This was fairly new at the time. Back in the 1960s, this would have been revolutionary, and in many ways, that was the case. It was very ahead of its time. Now, the problem is that the technology that went into its electronic design means that it actually wasn't very good at doing any of that. It was repeatedly prone to malfunction, and fixing it required specialists that, knew about the new technology. When the technology caught up with the design, and they were able to consider fixing the 74s, the problem came down to the fact of efficiency. The 74s were designed to pull what are called boat trains, and these trains actually had dried up over the course of the years. Many people weren't actually on them, so the sole purpose of the 74 wasn't even there by the time the 1970s rolled around. So when it was high time where they could have corrected their problems, it just wasn't worth it. It's a shame too, because again, the 74 wasn't necessarily a bad design, it's just the electronics weren't ready for what they were trying to do. It was ahead of its time by far too much, and the crews couldn't deal with its inefficiency. Failures were prominent, and things just kept breaking down. It made them unpopular. It didn't help the fact that they were super noisy, and nobody likes that. Nobody likes a train that makes all the noise in the universe, especially a diesel. Steam engines can get away with it because they're kind of a classic sound, and people kind of like hearing them because they're so rare nowadays. But back then, in a diesel, who likes to hear a diesel? Nobody likes to really hear a diesel, especially one that's loud to the point of absurdity, which apparently the 74 was. So, yeah, it was scrapped. All of them were. And as far as I could tell, none were kept for preservation. The Alco Century 855. Oh, Alco. Oh, you used to be such a reliable name in the course of making trains. Oh dear. The Alco Century 855 was a diesel engine designed specifically for Union Pacific. At the time, it was one of the most powerful diesel engines ever built. In fact, before the EMD DDA-40X in '69, it was the most powerful diesel locomotive ever built. And admittedly, it looked pretty much the part. I mean, look at this thing. It looks awesome. I love the design overall. It just looks like it's ready to pull some stuff. And when it was working, it was good at that. That's just the issue, though, when it was working. The 855 was notorious for consistent, repeated mechanical unreliability. It broke if you looked at it the wrong way. For such a powerful design, you'd think the opposite, but no. It just kept breaking every single time they went to do anything with it. They were only in service less than 8 years due to overheating and poor performance, and they were scrapped in 1972. Which is a shame, because again, I think they look really good from a visual perspective. It's just a matter of the fact that they didn't frickin' work. Look, Alco, my guys, my homies, my main men and women. You can make it look great, but if it doesn't function, it doesn't mean anything. The Baldwin RP-210. Speaking of big names in locomotive manufacturing that fell off, welcome to the world of Baldwin. The 210 was the last locomotive to bear the Baldwin name, and much like the 855, looks really cool. It's got that classic 1950s and 60s bulldog nose design, but it's sleek, really pulled back, and very, fast looking. It's a very neat design. I really like it aesthetically, but again, this is a matter of form over function. Now the 210 is a weird one, because the 210 was designed to work in 3 different ways. It was diesel electric, technically. However, it could function off of its diesel engine, it could function off of electric pantograph lines, and it could also function off of a third rail. Now the idea was actually quite a good one. Make it so that it could function on a lot of different kinds of lines, so the railroads wouldn't necessarily have to redesign their railway to accommodate the new engine. Now, on one hand, I'm not sure how much I agree with that. As good an idea as it sounds, why not just make it a full diesel? Diesel fuel at the time was, relatively cheap. That's why people started using them. Just make it a regular diesel. Why'd you have to add the electric stuff? Because electric is cheaper? I mean, I get that. Maybe just add the third rail, but the pantograph too, on top of everything else? Okay, sure, whatever. That's fine. Let's just do it that way. Did it work? No. No, it didn't. The 210 was plagued with just so many problems. Transitioning between a bunch of different rail types in terms of whether it's a third rail or the pantograph or diesel meant that it required a lot of mechanical finesse, and the 210 just wasn't up to snuff when it came to this. For example, in 56, on January 7th, one of the 210's contact shoe for the third rail misaligned with the underside of the third rail, and it passed through a switch point. The damaged contact scraped along the energized rail and created an arc of electricity, which set the locomotive's truck on fire, otherwise known as being very, very bad. It didn't help that the pantograph that the locomotive was designed for actually couldn't reach New York Central's rail towards the overhead, wire. It needed the small diamond-style pantograph, which the 210s weren't fitted with. And even when the engines were working, they often weren't, they were plagued with poor riding quality and numerous mechanical issues. The transmissions liked to overheat, the road mechanics were unfamiliar to the foreign prime mover, and often they had to forage for metric hardware components at the local Volkswagen dealerships. This is relevant because the maintenance manuals that were supplied for the diesel engines were only available in German. The point is that everything about the 210 was just a mess, which really sucks because, again, it's a really nice looking engine. The 210 served for a relatively short amount of time. They were so plagued with issues that they just weren't worth it in the end. At the end of their life, they were shifted to pure diesel work, which, to be honest, is probably what they should have been in the first place. They probably would have done a lot better if they hadn't gone with the three-pronged strategy, making them available on everything possible at the time, when in reality, that was their main issue. They couldn't do anything particularly well, but if they had done just one thing well, they probably would have been more successful. Like I said, this was the last train produced by Baldwin, and yeah, that makes sense. The Advanced Passenger Train, or APT, by British Rail. See, I told you British Rail was still going to be on this list. You didn't believe me? I wasn't making it up. The APT is, well, okay. I'm going to try to be nice here, because in many ways the APT was an attempt to be revolutionary. Understand that back in the late 60s and 70s, all the rage talk was high-speed rail. Japan had torn the world asunder with their high-speed rail line, creating a market for trains that some people didn't believe was there. At the time, air travel was all the rage, but the high-speed rail could make that kind of distance in the relatively same amount of time at a fraction of the cost. France would follow suit with their own high-speed train, and the UK was not to be left out. However, the UK had a problem. See, they didn't have nearly as much, space to work with, and much of the UK's territory was already taken up by pre-existing rail line. So what were they going to do? They couldn't just rip up the rail line because people used the rails in the UK. Trains have always been popular there, and there wasn't exactly space to produce a new rail. What about instead, if they didn't make the rails work with the train, what if they made the train work with the rails? Enter the APT. The idea was actually pretty ingenious. Instead of making high-speed rails with long, slow, curving turns that allowed the train to maintain speed, they would create a train that actually tilted on its own into the turns, so regardless of how tight the turn was, they could still maintain a pretty decent amount of speed. It was a pretty good idea on paper, and the design phase went into work right away. Except there's a major problem here. They didn't really consider that, the technology just wasn't there. I gotta give it to British Rail for trying to innovate. I mean, we just talked about the last time they did that with an electronic system. This one is about a tilt train, and back in the 70s, that would be pretty revolutionary. But the technology wasn't ready yet. And when they finally debuted the APT, it was plagued with issues. To begin with, the train was not very enjoyable to ride. It was rough, at best. And the tilt on the train was so quick and people couldn't judge for it that it tended to make passengers physically ill. People already suffer from motion sickness on regular trains. The fact that this train went out of its way to tilt at the same time meant that people suffering from this actually had a worse time on the train. In addition, the APT actually couldn't maintain its high speed for very long because it had to share the rail with other slower trains, which for some reason British Rail didn't think to, consider the fact that there would be other trains that were like in the way. It would be going as fast, and the APT would have to slow down, and it would defeat the purpose of this ridiculously expensive project. Technically speaking, the APT was produced twice. Once in 1970, the other time in 1977 and 1980. Its first introduction was a disaster, though its second one was much better. They had corrected the tilting issue, and made it so that the trains were actually pretty okay to ride by then. But by then, the hype was over. People had already decided the APT was a complete piece of crap, and there was no change in their minds. A lot of people just didn't want to ride it, and those that did found it enjoyable, but again, it was still sharing the rails with slower trains, so its speed was irrelevant. It still had to go the same speed as a regular train could. The fact was, unless you replaced the entire network with these advanced trains, it wouldn't matter. The hilarious part is that British Rail, it was on the right track, because an Italian company bought the patents for the APT and actually produced their own tilt train, which then the Brits bought back from them, and now use those tilt trains on their current lines? Wait, you got, what? I know it's expensive to develop something, but you just bought back your own invention. Goodness, this is a disaster. It just turned out so poorly in every conceivable way, even though it was really a great revolutionary idea. It was just before its time. Oh dear. Well, with that, till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.